So, Helen, we decided we are going to chat a little bit about task distribution and allocation and roles and this approach that you have and you've been exploring about dynamic roles. So just to recap, the piece that we were just chatting off camera that, halfway through, I was like, let's start recording because this is very juicy. We were looking at how at the HAM we could be distributing tasks in a different way, just to explore a different method and a different way to do things that we can also learn about. So then we can pass it on to others. And we were talking about changing the idea, like, I really like what you said in terms of like changing the language out of tasks to accountabilities. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that and like what do you mean by both things?
Yeah, so I think using the word tasks, it kind of constrains us potentially. It helps us. It kind of already predetermines how you might do the task. And whereas if you're thinking about doing outcomes or accountabilities, success measures or something like that, that's more open. So if you describe what I want to achieve by doing this role or task, you're not specifying the detail of how it's going to be done. So it's much more open to you thinking about how best to do it. And it gives you much more autonomy in delivering. So it's much more adult to adult and less directive, top down.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially like as we were saying, like there's tasks, for example, there's tasks or there's specific things that need to happen that are very kind of maybe they're more automatic, like, if you're bookkeeping and we need to maintain that because we need to do it for legal reasons, it's like there's a particular way to use the software and a particular way in which the accountant needs to see things. So it is kind of more standard. But if we abstract it out and we say, well, what we're trying to do here is we need to make sure that we are ready for our taxes, right? That all our legal requirements are done. So that will be the accountability. So that will be the success of what we're looking for. And then how you actually get there, it might be different for different people to explore.
Yeah. With that example, like as you said, it's already really quite predefined and quite specific. Yeah. And so you're probably going to have like a document explaining the process, and in most cases they'll follow it. But you're not leading with that, like, this is how you do it. This is the outcome we want. There's stuff there to help you do it. I think it's much more relevant for the other kind of roles where it's much more down to your own strengths and your energy to do stuff. You'll see ways of doing it that the person who might be originally sort of discussing that role wouldn't see, because that's where your skill and expertise is in.
So one of the pieces that we explore sometimes is about, like there's multiple ways. We still call it tasks, so I still have that in my brain, but like there's multiple ways to do the work and to distribute what needs to happen, right? And we talk sometimes like either that's how we've been doing things at the HAM a lot, is either like this is what needs to happen this month, these are our main goals, this is what we want to achieve, these are some of the specific tasks or specific pieces of work, who wants to pick it up, who has capacity, who has the skills, and so on. That's one way, and that kind of is flowy and changes depending on who's in the team and who can do it. Then sometimes we work in working groups, so it's like a little group of people that are, okay, we're going to pick on marketing or we're going to pick on accounting, and then internally they distribute the what needs to happen in their own way. And then sometimes we work with roles, right? Like, and this idea that you're bringing of dynamic roles, that is more like you pick on that specific, I'm really interested, for example, what we were talking before about increasing our, like our awareness in the market of how people know about us, and you will choose on your own way on how to get there. Do you want to tell us a bit more about dynamic roles and what you've seen working?
Connecting it back to the tasks that we were talking about with the HAM. So a lot of people start there, like they just do a brain dump of like all the stuff that they're doing, and get it all down on the paper or the mural, whatever, and then they group it to understand like where some of the sort of similarities of tasks are, where it's often like the skill set might overlap. So they're grouping that together, and that grouping often can become a role, but it's quite fluid. And then the idea of the role, or the dynamic role, is that it has an outcome. So it's got a purpose, the reason for that role existing. Like our organisation can't exist without this role. This role is needed. This purpose is needed. So it can be just that purpose. Then ideally, you also need some accountabilities underneath it. So just a little bit more detail around any sort of specific things you might be doing underneath that purpose. So the one we were talking about there, which was like the purpose to increase awareness of the hum. There might be some key accountabilities underneath that might be engaging with social media, because that is a very specific thing you want to do, or maybe you want to specifically focus on Twitter or LinkedIn and you want to just capture that there, and then it just gives that slight more detail without going into like exactly what you're going to be doing and how often and blah blah blah, and that's not needed. Keeps it nice and broad. And then the idea is that that person is stewarding and looking after that role. So they're looking after this role, which is potentially called awareness, an awareness role, awareness of the hum. And on a regular rhythm, we were talking about how you review it, either when it's needed to be reviewed or on a regular, like maybe quarterly basis. You're looking at all of the roles, either within the team or, depending on the size of the organisation, the whole organisation. And people can say, well, I'm really interested in upskilling in this area. Like, I'm really interested in stewarding that role for a bit, or I'm running out of energy on this one. Is anyone else interested? Or I'm going to be away for 6 months. Who can take on my roles while I'm away? It's that understanding the fluidity of the work that the dynamic roles gives you. So you're not thinking, oh, there's one job description. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm going away. Who can take over this job description while I'm away? It's because it's already broken down into granular bits and it's already quite moving. It's much easier to go, oh, I'm going away. Can you take this bit? Can you take that role? Can you take that role? And be accountable for it while I'm away. So I'm no longer accountable because I'm away, and I know who is going to be accountable when I'm not there. And that's great, like in the moment, like when you're planning something like annual leave because you know it's coming, but it's also really good in those emergency situations where someone's like off sick, something happens to the business, suddenly I know you've acquired another business and you need to merge together. It's that sort of like immediate need, or like there's been a big impact on sales or something, you're scaling up or scaling down and you need to respond really quickly. It's that flexibility and the visibility. So you can just move much quicker.
I have a question with this, because normally when we talk about, well, if we distribute in tasks, there are certain tasks that are recurring, right? And they're more like straightforward, you do this and that and that. Normally we have documentation around it, right? It's like, this is where you find the information that you need. This is where the buttons that you need to click, and this is what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And what we ask is that after, if we pass on that task, you read that, but you also improve it, right? So you can also in that documentation put things like, these are the things that I find challenging. These are the questions that I have. This is what it will be great to have, to find a way to improve. Then the next person can keep on working on that and improve the documentation for the next person, right? Like it's like a continuous growth. So would you work in something like this as well with the roles? Because if you're passing on to another person, does that person need to start from scratch, or will they start already from what the previous person did? Like, I'm asking this based on this idea of we don't want to give tasks and really predefined things, right? We want to give it a little bit more open.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That happens now, right? In reasonably traditional organizations, people are documenting their processes that need to be documented. So I feel like it's the same thing. Like if you're passing on a responsibility, then you've got the documentation with it. I almost feel like it's a separate issue to dynamic roles. It's actually just how well you are documenting what needs to be documented. I'm not over documenting stuff and just keeping it at the level that's needed without that like extreme like control of like, this is exactly what you need to do. So yeah, again, the accountabilities of the role, I suppose, help that fluidity and like that ability to deliver how you best see fit. But it's also recognizing the value of the knowledge base in the organization and capturing it. which to me is, it's a separate task. It's connected to roles, but it's a separate thing that we need to be thinking about.
It's a tricky one, right? Because on one hand, we want to keep it open enough and broad enough that give people space to explore different options on how they do it. But at the same time, you don't want to leave them like, be like, okay, you go now. And they're like, oh my God, I don't even know what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And having to, you know, like reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
It's an interesting piece to understand like what, and I guess I might be related to what different people might need. Some people might want complete, no, just let me do it and I want to totally find my way. And some people might want more hands-on, like tell me what you had and I can keep going with it, right?
I also think
it's more flexible.
Third representation of the organization as well, like that organizational knowledge and experience in some sort of knowledge base is really valuable, because no matter how I don't know, self-determined or autonomous you want to be, it's still very useful to build on what's gone before and understand what's gone on before. So yeah, I wouldn't really be advocating for like clean slate unless, I don't know, I mean, there's always an exception, isn't there? Yeah, it's interesting.
I can think of a few colleagues that we have that might be the exception. Definitely.
Yeah.
I think like there's a piece here as we were talking, just we started talking briefly talking about this piece before, in terms of when you're thinking about what you're accountable for and what are those deliverables of, or why this is important and what is the outcome that we want to see. It's not just an individual decision, right? It's a collective one, because you need to like talk together about what does the organization need, what will be useful, and how do we together frame it. Then what the individual chooses and how they like mold it in to fit with their own personality and their own needs is a bit different. But how do we do that piece together without constraining again?
Yeah, I think that's comes from sociocracy, doesn't it? And holacracy. They have a very clear process for like creating a role, I suppose, and it's done as a group, so that you're usually in a circle, or if you're not in circles, people who are going to be affected by that role are then working together to agree the accountabilities for that role. So usually it's not okay for just one person to add an accountability to a role. It's much more like as in like a group decision, usually consent on that accountability, but you're not having to necessarily speak to the whole organization. It's the people who are most affected by it and that they agree to it. So any sort of changes to accountabilities usually needs a broader conversation.
And maybe like, let's talk a little bit about what is important when we're looking at this, because we went into, okay, dynamic roles are one way to do this, but what are the challenges that we've seen that this might be useful for, or where are we coming from in terms of more traditional spaces that this might be an answer for?
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Okay, so there's like the reasons why might people consider doing it this way, like what are the trigger points? There's many, and I think it's obviously depends on the individual situation. It's the fact that the pace of change is getting so much quicker, and the world of work is more complex rather than linear, and so not being able to know what's coming, and so therefore you need to be more agile and more adaptable. So people are hitting problems when they're scaling their business, and they're like they're not able to change and respond to the market quickly enough. They're seeing problems maybe when they need, I suppose it's the same as scaling up, that increasing capacity. They need to find capacity, and they might be trying to do that within the staff that they've already got. So that's a very tricky thing to do. And so having visibility of what actually is going on and where the space is and where the give is as a group, not as someone managing, so like everyone really understands what's going on, can be really valuable in finding capacity. I think what I've also seen is organizations wanting to have to get the stuff done that otherwise wouldn't get done. So I think they see that more in smaller organizations, when they're all sort of firefighting and like just getting the work done, but they're not doing the other stuff, a lot of stuff we touch on with the hum, like around marketing, finance, governance, brand. These are sort of like end up being periphery tasks, and they get sort of pushed aside because you're so busy getting the work done. And so I think as organizations grow, they're like, actually, we need to have some accountability around this, because it's always going to get pushed to the side. So it's that feeling of like bringing that in. I think there's also a sense I see around identifying unseen roles. So like maybe there's some sort of conflict going on where things are being done and it's not being recognized. And so it's the need to actually surface that. And so therefore people can then improve their flow and their process, because they're actually being much more clear about what's really happening. You can see that quite a lot in agile teams. There might be certain steps of the process that isn't documented officially, but it's happening. And so roles helps them document it and visualize it and go, okay, this is why we're having a conflict around this area, because actually we're not being explicit about who's doing what and what's being done. There's some of the triggers, I suppose, I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's great. That's super useful. I wonder as well, you know, like a few times I heard you name this thing about kind of having an issue with the idea that tasks are very specified, and like you're telling someone this is what you need to do and this is how you're gonna do it.
Yeah.
Like, what's in there? Tell me more about it. Because what, you know, like behind me is like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a need for like autonomy, right? Like that's a need for mastery and autonomy and feeling like you're capable and you can do things and you'll find your way and bringing the creativity to it. But where does that reaction that I heard from you, if I heard it right, like what's triggering it? I feel like there's some stories from the past, or there's ways in which you experienced roles in previous work environments, more traditional probably, that felt constrictive. Is there something around that?
Yes, I definitely get quite triggered by being told what to do.
Me too.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know whether some people feel that more than others. And obviously I think that depends a lot on your previous experiences. But I also feel like it's quite a normal reaction, and having understood like what motivates people at work, the whole purpose, mastery, autonomy, relatedness, like there's evidence behind that actually increases well-being and happiness at work. So it's not just my personal desire for autonomy and my desire not to be told what to do. There's a broader sense of that amongst the workplace. And so if you want engaged employees and you want motivated employees, looking at autonomy is a good place to look. And so by giving them a role that has an outcome, and actually I shouldn't even say giving them, they choose to take on a role that has an outcome, they're already having much more autonomy. And then there's the whole issue around, well, if I'm very new to the role, like we were touching on before, and I don't really know, I can then choose to get support. Like, who can I go to who's done this before, who is willing to teach, who is willing to support and coach, and having that understanding of the skill set in the organisation. I touched on something else there, which is about stewarding roles.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I'm getting more and more excited about this idea. It actually comes from Sam Slade's Going Horizontal book. And when she talks about roles, she uses the language of stewarding roles. And it really resonates with me. And I see that actually as a word that I think a lot of people have overlooked when they've been implementing roles. They've been doing it in a very traditional way of like, okay, here's the work, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. Whereas the nub of it actually is for you to choose. That's where the real autonomy is. So you can think, okay, looking at these roles, which do I have the expertise to do? Like, which, do I have the experience and knowledge? Which do I like really have the energy for? Like, what am I excited about? Because you see so much more is done when you're excited about it. And you're much more likely to explore different ways. You're going to put more of your personal time into it. Yeah, it's just a very cool way to get things done when you've got energy for it. And And then you've got this sort of sense of what needs to be done in the organisation for the organisation to achieve its purpose. So you've always got to be thinking about that and the bigger picture. Who else is in the room? Like, okay, I really, really want to do this thing, but I know that this person is going to do it in half the time. They've got a lot more experience, and now is not the time for me to pick that up. But I'm putting it out there that I'd like to learn that in future. So it's just getting that bigger picture of what's going on and not just being about self. You're really focused on the organisation purpose.
Yeah, I really like that idea of, combining this piece on accountabilities or responsibilities or like desired outcomes. And where you're choosing to steward that outcome for the organization for a period of time, right? It's even decoupling it from traditional language around roles or what that might mean.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. Let's play with it. Let's play with it at the ham.
Definitely. I think any way that you can almost depersonalize or dehumanize a role really helps with that separation. So there's a lot to be said for like how you attach yourself to a role, like how that role is almost part of your ego, like part of yourself. Popular question, isn't it, when you meet someone, oh, what do you do? Oh, I do this, and you reel off your job title. It's not really what you're doing, right? You're doing all these other stuff. But you're so attached to that job title, it's actually defining who you are. And without that, like if you take that job title away, who are you? That's like a really difficult question for most people, myself included. Like, it's so part of ourselves. So I think that stewarding thing it's so important, but yet so hard because you've got to separate yourself. And if you're using language like stewarding, and you can depersonalize it. So another tip is trying to think of ways that you can label or name a role that isn't so human, like isn't a thing, like a thing that someone's doing. So like, a marketer example, that is, I am a marketer. Whereas actually, if the role title is something else, like increasing awareness, that's not so personal. I can't be so attached to it. It's not actually part of my identity. I think there's a lot to explore around that.
That's really cool. In the past, we have played, with this idea of like micro roles that is more like I think it's really tied to what we're talking about, and creating like funny names for it, or like, like the marketing ninja, or I don't know, newsletter ninja or something like this, that we actually used as a way to do that as well, like decouple a little bit from this idea of, I'm the head of department of what's or not. That it feels kind of impersonal.
Yeah.
So I like this of even decoupling even further into, it's not even a title, it's not even a person, it's an action.
Yes. Yeah.
That's super good.
Yeah, that
so
is really
exciting. I wonder, like, what are your thoughts in terms of like, can dynamic roles be shared, for example, or can dynamic roles or desired outcomes be gathered in terms of working groups? How do you see working in that way?
Oh, there's multiple questions there, Natty. What was the first one?
So it's more about, do you see this idea of dynamic roles basically detaching from tasks and seeing it more as outcomes, and having people choosing into those outcomes that are more engaging or more motivating for them? Can that also be a shared responsibility, for example, between 2 people or 3 people or 4 people? Basically, can we do shared roles or working groups with the same idea?
I don't know. This is something I'm playing with. I genuinely don't know. There's quite a lot of talk about only one person is accountable. So very traditional management, you have something called a RACI, where you in a project you do who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And there can be multiple people responsible and only one person accountable. And that makes sense to me, to have one person accountable, because otherwise if there's any muddy water around that, it becomes very difficult to actually say, oh no, I did this. I'm accountable for it, I've done it. Whereas if you're suddenly splitting that, it's one outcome, like, I think somewhere you need to define what the split is. And so I think where you can share it is on a time basis. because I can be accountable for it on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and you can be accountable for the rest of the time. That might work. But I do know that there are places where they do share a role and they are sharing the one accountability. And I know that has caused problems. So I think the advice is to avoid it. But then at the same time, I can't say definitely don't do it, because I think there will be situations where that might be the only option. So I think I'd probably treat it with care and be aware that it's probably going to be quite risky. The thing is, the thing that I'm stumbling on with roles is this idea of accountability and responsibility. So as I said with the RACI, multiple people can be responsible, but only one person accountable. So I might be accountable for increasing awareness of the hum, but I can ask other people to do the work. So other people can become responsible, but immediately you can see the hierarchy, yeah, between like me, I'm now almost managing that. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So in my ideal world, I want to close that gap. And so the person who's stewarding the role is accountable and responsible. That's in my ideal world. I know that's not always the case, or not possible in a lot of organizations. But the flatter you are, the more you're going to get that accountability and responsibility together. And then by doing that, I mean, that's just the fundamental, isn't it, of self-management. You're just shortening the gap. So like you're at the coalface, like I understand the situation, so therefore I'm accountable and I'm willing to do the work because I know what's needed, rather than having to manage anyone.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to see it. I guess that the key on that specific piece is about, yeah, are we changing the language just to change the language? Or we're actually doing this, right? Like, or are we being real? Because I've seen this as well, right? Like till washing. Till washing is everywhere, right? It's like, like, oh, we just have a new cool way to describe the same thing that we've been doing forever. We haven't changed much more than the language. So it's like, what's behind it? What are the principles when you're working in this way that people need to be paying attention to? What is important here when we're doing this?
Yeah.
Do you have some distilled principles to share?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's not about all of this like process and different things you could do. If your mind and your way of being isn't in the right place, or isn't wanting to be in the right place, it's just, yeah, like you say, teal washing. Like, yeah, pretend you're sort of putting this veneer. So like for me, the key principles are participation over managing. So that's what I was just touching on, like what can I actually participate in rather than managing other people doing stuff. So it's that sort of taking that sort of ownership. I said ownership because my other principle though is actually contradictory to that. My other principle is about stewarding versus ownership. So you're stewarding the role rather than owning the role. My third one is more about inviting people to take on roles rather than allocating them. So again, it's just increasing their autonomy. And that, I mean, that's so easy to say, but it's such a reversal of what happens in most traditional organizations. And it's a top down, like, this is what we need. We're going to interview. We're going to, okay. So you're kind of putting yourself forward to interview, but then they are choosing. Whereas actually this is down to the individual to decide. So they might be nominated by their peers to take it on, but actually it's still my decision about whether I do it or not. It's certainly not a top-down decision. It's a collective decision in terms of nominating me.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that aligns with my principles, right? In terms of whichever way we choose to distribute what needs to happen, to distribute tasks or allocate the jobs that need done. For me, it's about how are we doing that? And it's not like we're passing it on or we're telling people. It's more like we choose together who's the right people to do what. And that person ultimately chooses what they're actually doing, because that's the way to be engaged in what's happening. And we're treating each other as adults, right? Instead of like moving from parent-child to adult, where it's like, I trust you that you're picking this up and you're going to do your best to deliver on what you say you're going to do, and you're going to find your way. And I don't have to be micromanaging or telling you the specifics, right? That's pretty important too, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty much the basis of it, Natty.
Yeah, great. Well, I love it. I'm loving all this. and you're going to be running a training on the 11th of July. Can't remember exactly the time, but it's going to be great. And I'm guessing that on the training as well, you're going to be sharing some more practical tools, like how people can actually work with this. What are some like ways in which you can start looking into distributing things in dynamic roles, right?
Yeah, we'll be covering the principles we've just been talking about, any groundwork that you need to put in place, and any other considerations that you need to think about. We'll also play around with templates as well, so you start to get a real life sense of what a role might look like, and therefore how that might be in the workplace. And we'll have a chance to discuss.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm looking forward to chatting more about different ways in which we can distribute things, and also playing internally, right, at the Ham, and then we can share with others what we're learning about it.
Yeah, cool. Me too.
Yay. Well, thank you, Helen. I'm going to stop the recording now.